I read Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep But Don't Have To, or maybe that's the wrong subtitle. It's Unlocking the Power of Sleep in Dreams. And I want to start by a quote, and then I want to go into how I now see sleep and what I want to share to the world about my new-found understanding of sleep. Amazing breakthrough! Scientists have discovered a revolutionary new treatment that makes you live longer. It enhances your memory and makes you more creative. It makes you look more attractive. It keeps you slim and lowers food cravings. It protects you from cancer and dementia. It wards off colds and the flu. It lowers your risk of heart attacks and stroke, not to mention diabetes. You'll even feel happier, less depressed and less anxious. Are you interested? I read Why We Sleep for the first time, or rather listened to it a few years ago. And a few years ago I already tried to implement some of the things, but I also was mostly ignorant maybe about the other things. So what I eventually did is I dissolved my sleep system into nothingness and eventually just went to bed at 10 p.m. That's the last few weeks, rather only. And this was actually already before I read Why We Sleep for the second time. Now, in short, I don't want to actually discuss so much the book itself, but much more my newfound understanding of sleep, as I think this, at least for myself, if I want to see this in the future, will be more interesting. Now, everybody can read the book, and I actually do not have access to the book right now. I only have access to a few quotes, because I actually just listened to it. Now, what does the book discuss? It's Why We Sleep. Now, of course, the book is very long, but to maybe shorten it down, and I don't want to pin down Matthew Walker on my summary, but that's obviously just my summary. Being awake, and that's also maybe my understanding and my framing of this mentally. Now, being awake basically draws from resources, and it draws from the resources that you have. Now, being awake as you move through time, you basically have to fight off entropy. Entropy as the thing that basically makes things disorganized. Very simplified. And then, if you want to live, you have to keep things organized, and this requires energy. Now, if you think about your computer, and you have your computer, and then you want to back up your computer into the cloud, then you can establish a process which would be continuous. This continuous process would maybe, of course, what is continuous? Maybe it's every 10th of a second, maybe it's every second, maybe it's every 10 minutes. So the question of what continuous is probably also, to some extent at least, based on our understanding of time. Maybe the 1/100000th of a second would be continuous for somebody else who had a different framing of time, or time framing, you could also say. Now, or frame rate, just rather. I think certain insects have actually a higher time resolution compared to humans. But that's just something I've listened to or heard somewhere. Now, if you want to back up something, let's say it's a very important computer. Then, or let's just say it's files. You want to back up files. Then the one option would be to have a continuous schedule. Actually, I do have a backup program like this, and I can either select continuous or maybe a certain interval. Now, of course, both are kind of the same thing. Both decide whether and how you want to back up things. It's probably once per unit of time. So continuous is just a label for very small time frames, whereas not continuous, or maybe once a week, for example, would be a larger time frame. So what it both determines is the frequency of the backup. Now, the question is what frequency of backup, or rather, not now backup, but regeneration do we now have? And now I want to go back again to the backup example. If you want to back up something with, so basically I have Backblaze, and Backblaze is a computer storage program. I also used other programs in the past, Google Drive, OneDrive, Dropbox, I don't know. But what I want to say with this is, this program is installed on a PC. And this PC has a certain cognitive power, or also just computational power. This computational power at any point in time is limited. So if you think about the computational power, about maybe you think about the computational power in 100%. Let's just say it's 100% in the beginning. Now, in the beginning, it's 100%, and then a certain amount of this processing power is dedicated to tasks the computer needs to have running. Now, if all the combined tasks processing power, or the processing requirement, exceeds the processing power that is available, then we probably have a shutdown or something like this from the computer. Now, ideally, all the tasks stay basically below the at the maximum threshold all the time, which would be 100%. Now, if you add something like a backup progress, not a backup progress, but a backup process, then this adds to this demand, to this requirement of processing power at any given point in time. Of course, again, it's just a frequency, how much processing power per unit of time. The question now is, what would be the ideal schedule for something like this? Now, what I've realized is that if I have this running in the background all the time, then I have less processing power available for using the different programs on my computer, including recording software, for example. But if I then have it once a week, and then let's just say I have it on Sunday, and then I would have to schedule something where I'm not on my notebook, but nevertheless my notebook is on, and this backup actually then can happen. So therefore I would have to schedule something like this maybe once a week. The question now is, what does this mean? This means that in this time I cannot use my computer basically at all, because it is just then running continuously, and of course, all the different fragments of processing power that have been taken or otherwise would have been taken continuously over time are now taken in one huge block, and therefore you cannot do much of anything else. And this analogy, I think, holds obviously so much weight, I think, when you then compare it to sleep. Because we are a computer, basically. We are information processing machines, but that's just now something I said. And of course, other people have said it before, and therefore I don't want to claim this, but I also don't want to say this person said this, and therefore I now said it. No. If we process information all day long, and we are computers that can actually run around. Now, of course, our understanding of computers is based on our definition of computers, which is something that we are not. A human is not a computer because a computer is a computer, and because words are usually a defined set of things, or seem to be like a defined set of things that describe something else, and because human and computer are defined different at this point in time, of course, you can then make the analogy that humans are kind of like a computer, and then it kind of works again. But what I'm trying to say here is that either we would have a process that is required. So let's assume we have a required process, and this required process now is sleep. We don't know what it exactly does. Let's just assume we don't know what it exactly does. What we do know is that it can either run continuously, but continuously is obviously just another simplification for a certain frequency, or it can run with a certain frequency. Then the question is, what would be the certain frequency? Now, because the sun is in the middle and the earth is revolving around the sun and also turns slightly, and then it also rotates around itself, so I cannot rotate my hand because, well, then it gets really complicated, at least with the motion of my hand. Especially with the torque in this regard, I think. Is it called torque? I don't know. What I'm trying to say with this is that the day, because the sun shines on the earth at certain parts of the day and sometimes not, and also winter and summer maybe, and summer maybe meaning that we are more active compared to winter, maybe less active, would mean that there is maybe a certain window of time in which we cannot do anything anyway, or not that we cannot do anything anyway. It's just that there are basically certain probabilities that you do something. Let's just say it's winter and you want to go out at the night. Then there is no light, and you also would have to expend a lot of energy on basically keeping yourself warm. Let's just say it's winter and it's day. Then it at least means that you now have light, which means you can see things. The probability of stumbling over something and falling to death into something is less likely. Or, of course, now we have lights and so on and so forth, but that's not probably how most of evolution worked on us with modernity, without modernity. That's what I'm trying to say. So the last changes that have been made kind of manually by us are not something that has probably been reflected too much in our genes or in our genome. Now, going back to sleep. If sleep has a certain function, let's just call it regeneration, then sleep can either be scheduled, an analogy with the computer, either in a continuous manner, and this would mean that we would have to run around constantly with a background process. This background process would, now let's assume, it would have a certain proportion of our time. Let's assume the day has 24 hours. Then we assume that everybody needs about 8 hours of sleep, or between 7 to 9, and 8 happens to be basically the maximum of the bell-shaped curve. Now, we assume 8 hours. Because the day has 24 hours, that's now a third of our time. Which means that we would have two options. We could either be less capable, and let's just assume it basically scales like the 24-hour day and the 8-hour sleep window we currently have mostly. Then we would assume we would reduce our processing power by around 33% or about a third. If we just assumed that this would transfer linearly, even though it probably wouldn't, or I don't know. This means regeneration would have to basically be there constantly. Now, the other option would be that we consolidated all of this regeneration process into a window, or into that window where we couldn't do much of anything anyway, which probably would be when there is less light, when there is less warmth, when there is less animals running around in order to be hunted, when it's more likely that we would fall to death anyway if we live in the mountains, for example, or something like this. And that's basically, all these probabilities seem to stir towards night sleep, towards one window of night sleep in which you then have different phases. Now, there also seems to be, at least as it currently is happening, or as sleep is happening in humans, or it seems to be happening mostly in one big window, even though some people also sleep a little bit during the day, but there seem to be no populations at least left at this point in time that sleep throughout the day multiple times. Now it seems to be that there have been populations which went to bed earlier and then were up a little bit during the night. And there also seem to be a lot of different mechanisms going on, such as different people having different sleep schedules, such as a group that has enemies. Let's just say it's the wild or nature or other groups would have basically at all times protection by people going earlier to sleep and waking up earlier, and then by people staying up longer and then sleeping longer. So they would have kind of a protection. Now, there are many things Matthew Walker talks about, which I now didn't talk about, but mostly this framing of regeneration as a need that would now either reduce our output constantly during the day, or we just have to take one big block in terms of my backup, maybe someday, but then I can't use my computer at all, which is mostly what seems to be happening at sleep. And the other option would be that we would just be less capable, about 33% less capable. Would we then already be in modernity, being 33% less capable? But this is also not really a good comparison, because at night we would be awake at night, but we couldn't do much at night. So basically, it's probably all of these different optimizations that lead towards night sleep. And that's kind of now the understanding of sleep probably as regeneration. Now the question is, what function does sleep serve? And actually why we sleep is, I think, I listened to the book, and I actually still don't have a really good understanding of why we sleep. There seem to be these many different observations, such as if you go without sleep, memory consolidation seems to not be happening, either in these different sleep stages, such as NREM, such as REM, and deep sleep. Or is deep sleep actually also in NREM? I don't quite know at this point in time. Inadequate sleep, even moderate reductions for just 1 week, disrupts blood sugar levels so profoundly that you would be classified as pre-diabetic. And as I have, so this is another quote from Matthew Walker's book, as I have struggled probably with blood sugar management, even though I don't know, because I also don't track my blood sugar, because it's still quite expensive, but it seems to be the case that my body composition over the years changed, and not to my advantage. So I was just, with no amount of working out, with no amount of basically trying to do something different with nutrition, was able to revert it back to baseline. And this is still going on, and I still didn't know why. And the answer, if we take a look, or at least if I listened, or when I listened to Why We Sleep again, it seems to be just that my sleep was probably not as optimal as it could have been. And therefore, and this is also now an observation from my side, every now and then, when I actually used to sleep 4 hours a night and woke myself up after 4 hours with an alarm, obviously, or then also in the last months I tried 6 hours and then napping during the day, what actually seemed to be happening every now and then is that my body forced sleep on me, and then I slept for maybe 10 hours, for example, on a Sunday. Now, because I then slept this long, I was fasted longer, and I naturally was fasted longer, even though I also tried before intermittent fasting. And because I was fasted longer, it seemed that my body also was just not able to basically take the food I would otherwise maybe ingest a few hours after waking up already. So if I tried food, it just would taste like absolutely nothing. It would sometimes even taste disgusting. So it seemed that my body moved into a stage where it actually didn't want food at this point in time. And only by working out during the day and by doing lots of different things, or by simply waiting, I would then basically induce hunger again. Now, this also sometimes happened even if I didn't eat a lot. So it seemed to be not dependent on having eaten a lot before. So what I'm trying to say with this is, because sleep, if it happens in one big phase, in one big chunk of time, seems to, well, if you are sleeping, you cannot eat. And if you, instead of sleeping 4 hours, sleep 6 hours or then 8 hours, then you can eat for a longer period of time not. And what this means is, for the rest of the day, it basically becomes just easier. It becomes easier to fast, not to fast, but it becomes easier to have a longer fasting window during the day, because if you're not sleeping for 8 hours anyway, and then you shouldn't apparently not eat 2 hours before sleeping, and then maybe also not directly after standing up, then you already have 10-12 hours of fasting, which is already half of the day. So if you then have, let's say, 3 meals, and you pause for 4 hours in between, but of course the meal also takes time, then let's assume 3 hours of taking in food from the first calorie to the last calorie, then you only have, if I now calculate it correctly, 3 hours, so 3 times 3 hours in between those meals, which is then not very hard to do, but still you have this kind of intermittent fasting thing, which is then not really intermittent fasting, but rather circadian fasting. If you don't sleep the very first night after learning, you lose the chance to consolidate those memories, even if you get lots of catch-up sleep thereafter. In terms of memory, then sleep is not like the bank. You cannot accumulate a debt and hope to pay it off at a later point in time. Sleep for memory consolidation is an all-or-nothing event. I now want to talk about caffeine. When first listening to Why We Sleep, I stopped experimenting with caffeine. I don't know if it exactly coincided with having listened to Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep, but I stopped drinking caffeine. Now, for most of my youth and also my childhood, I avoided caffeine already. I just never began to drink caffeine. Why? If I talk about caffeine, I'm mostly talking about coffee, because I was not that aware that in other mixed drinks there was also caffeine, or that in chocolate there was also caffeine. I just was not that aware as a child. But what I was aware of is that every now and then there was like an article about caffeine and about pregnant women, and the fetuses seemed to turn out smaller. So there seemed to be an effect, at least in very small children or in unborn children, that they actually had a reduced body size with mothers drinking caffeine. That's at least what I remember. So during my entire youth, I already kind of avoided caffeine. Now then, I got into university and I thought maybe I give it a try. And that was already during the last years of school, actually. So I used it basically as a tool to boost my performance, my cognitive performance on test days. But I never could actually properly assess whether then I was actually performing better, or I actually was performing much worse and I just was thinking that I did perform better. So there was also kind of an absence of objective measurement. Of course, I then had grades, so I sometimes before a test actually drank caffeine. But similar to how I also tried with dextrose, or with dextrose, so basically sugar made from grapes, or basically, yeah, well, not just, what is actually dextrose? It's a good question, but it was all around when I was a child, and I ate these small bricks basically during tests in school or during exams in school in order to boost my performance. But what I also noticed is that I kind of had this then relationship of, okay, I need to now do this, therefore I take another thing. I need to now write the next 3 sentences of the abstract I need to write, let's take another thing. And something similar developed with caffeine, only after a very short time, that I would rely on caffeine. I would maybe not sleep for the entire night in order to prepare for an exam, and then rely on caffeine for the next day, which meant that I then crashed in the evening somewhere, or maybe I didn't, or maybe I wrote an exam and I actually was kind of passing, maybe because of the caffeine. What I'm trying to say with this is I introduced a new variable, and when I then listened to why we sleep, and the half-life of caffeine that seems to be very long, and therefore basically seems to be impacting your sleep anyway, and also kind of rule out the possibility of naps actually being properly kind of restorative. Because if I can't nap during the day, and also experimented a lot with napping in my university years already, if I nap for 10 minutes, for 20 minutes, then I often felt as if I basically had kind of was having a short mental boost again. And this mental boost was actually not that comparable to maybe something like food, but it was a little bit different. It was like I just had slept a little bit, maybe. And I actually then was able to doze off into these phases and then wake up again, and then I would maybe study for 40 minutes, for 50 minutes, sometimes for 100 minutes, and then I did a 20-minute nap, and then go into basically sleep again. And when I drank caffeine, I obviously could not do this, which means after some time, I just could not sleep, and I could not have this pattern. So, of course, this is only during the day. But what happens actually then at night? And then you have to think about caffeine, and when do you drink caffeine? And then Huberman years later would tell me to wait for 90 minutes. But at the end of the day, I think simplicity is often, of course, not very easy to achieve, but if I can make things simple. And let's just assume, and that's also what I kind of assumed after some time, I only have a given amount of energy. If I then take something like caffeine, then I don't get more energy. And if I rely on something like caffeine, then this mentally means that I now associate different states with maybe different drugs, such as caffeine. And this then creates a mental barrier in order to access a focus phase, which I otherwise would only induce by drinking caffeine. But ideally, I would be able to induce a focus phase, or to, let's say, work out also without music, and to work also without caffeine. And that's what I eventually landed on. And so I just quit caffeine. Similar to how I also quit alcohol, but that's not really about why we sleep. So I quit alcohol a few years back and never drank a drink since, because it seemed to just be irrational. The shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. The leading causes of disease and death in developed nations, diseases that are crippling healthcare systems such as heart disease, obesity, dementia, diabetes, and cancer, all have recognized causal links to the lack of sleep. In the last years, I began to notice this field developing that is longevity. So basically trying to live longer, maybe also to optimize your life. And one of the first books was not Why We Sleep, but Lifespan, Why We Age But Don't Have to. And I read a few other books in the last months and years. Outlive, for example, by Peter Attia, that came out. I also listened a lot to Huberman Lab, and I also listened to a lot of Peter Attia interviews, and so on and so forth. Now, in the last months and years already, there also has been this entrepreneur, let's just call Brian Johnson an entrepreneur, who is trying to reduce his age. And for my understanding of what age actually is, of course, age might be very complex, and it might be telomeres shortening, it might be something else happening, and maybe it's a loss of information, or I don't know at this point in time. And whatever I would now summarize it to be, it would probably wrong in either now or also 5 years or 10 years or 20 years of time. So for my personal understanding of why we age, is maybe that just we don't regenerate anymore. So there is an ideal state, and this ideal state is maybe not the ideal brain state that you reach at 18, but now the question here that I'm trying to induce a little bit is, of course, the body, or it seems to be that there seems to be a certain peak age in which the body is the most capable. But the mind, of course, develops over time. But of course, the mind then also degrades over time, meaning that it can learn less and less, and it actually might become less and less powerful. Now the question, but the mind is also that the carrier of all the information, the carrier basically of all the things we've learned. So therefore, of course, you don't want to have the brain of an 18-year-old, but you want to have the function of the brain of an 18-year-old. Maybe something like this, or along these lines. Now, if there is a lack of regeneration, towards the optimal state, then maybe there's a tool that would help you with regeneration. And as Matthew Walker put it in this book, sleep is nature's best attempt towards immortality. I think it was framed, or the sentence was something like this. And not specifically that this sentence now induced lots of new thinking about sleep and about living longer and so on and so forth in me, but it just frames it, I think, very nicely. If I don't put emphasis on sleep, and now there is this big discussion I had internally. The one thing was, so there are of course different variables. Like, if you have a job that pays for hours and that doesn't basically does not give you a marginal increase in output, whatever this means, or utility, with an increased performance of yourself, but is mostly paid by hours, or is mostly paid by margins, not by margins, but by units of your time, then the incentive to optimize for basically performance seems to be less. Now, that's maybe the incentive. But what this also means is that if you work more, then you can earn more. And if you have a job that is kind of capped by the hours and where there is not that much to be earned more, if you then are maybe 10% better, then the problem obviously is that shrinking down your sleep window at a given amount of working hours allows you to have more free time or to work more. And this is something I really struggled with, because I at least for some time of the week, did always things that were kind of time dependent, and not relative time dependent, but could not be optimized that much further. I mean, how much further can you optimize working out for 1 hour? Probably not that much. Of course, you can optimize the workout itself, but the hour is gone. No matter what you do in that hour, the hour is gone. You can optimize your workout within this. Maybe you can make your workout shorter, but it will always take 10 minutes to drive to the gym and 10 minutes back. Maybe you can do it in 8 minutes. Maybe you can do it in 7.5 minutes. But what I'm trying to say is, if you want to work for an hour, so the time is the constraint, then something like shortening down your sleep actually helps you get more out of your week, your day, and so on and so forth. So also, this maybe has this outcome of what do you do with what? So what do you want to do, and how do you choose something that maybe has actually an increase and incentivizes yourself to optimize all the time in order to get more output from what you put in, mostly in this case now the hours, compared to something where there is a fixed amount of hours, an absolute amount of time that you have to put in, that then incentivizes you to maybe sleep less. And I haven't quite found a solution to this, but it's just also something I wanted to mention. Routinely sleeping less than 6 or 7 hours a night demolishes your immune system, more than doubling your risk of cancer. In the last months, I actually had let's just call it, on a scale from 1 to 10, I had like a 1 or 2 on a health problem. And I couldn't quite find out what it was. So there seemed to be something wrong, and one of my organs responded, and the blood actually showed that it was not the one of the organs seemed to have a reaction to something I did, and I didn't know exactly what it was. But what I knew to a certain amount, or to a certain extent, is that obviously something I did caused this. And now if I again simplify all of this down to, okay, there is an ideal version of me that over time degrades. And as I already am not 18 anymore, it probably is already not 18. So I'm probably already declining. Now the question is, how can I restore myself back to, in all of these different areas, back to a level that is basically better? And the answer might be sleep, obviously. So I tried basically to sleep more. And that's kind of one of the first times I actually actively tried to sleep more and tried to just take a look at basically how my body sleeps if I just let it. And what happened is that I would sleep often, let's just call it a Sunday, for example, for like 10 hours, for 12 hours, sometimes 14 hours. And this was obviously not normal, but I also didn't really know how to solve this. So over the last years, I have set these anchor points during the day, and these anchor points would allow me to just switch activities, and also to mentally switch activities. So from a certain time to another certain time, I would just work out. And if I miss this, then it would be gone forever, because time is actually usually gone forever if you don't take it. And what I'm trying to say with this is that I eventually just try to see how much sleep my body takes. And as I saw that it was basically all over the place, and that my circadian rhythm then probably also was not properly aligned, I began to experiment, at least mentally, with the idea of maybe just increasing my sleep to 6 hours and sleeping 2 hours during the day, which then over a few additional months resulted in me changing to 8 hours of night sleep. Because, well, after reading this book, I probably cannot not. Now, the book also mentions that there are outliers, and I think if it was rounded up to 1% or something like this, or to full percentage points, then it was not even a full percentage point, or maybe not even 0.1% or something like this. What I'm speaking of is the amount of people that can sleep or can survive or can function normally on 5 to 6 hours a night. At least that's what I remember from the book. Adults 45 years or older who sleep fewer than 6 hours a night are 200% more likely to have a heart attack or stroke during their lifetime, as compared to those sleeping 7 to 8 hours a night. It is disquieting to learn that vehicular accidents caused by drowsy driving exceed those caused by alcohol and drugs combined. In the book, he talks for a certain amount of length, at least, or words or sentences, about how you can compare sleep deprivation to driving on alcohol. And even if you combine them both, then the negative impact seems to go upwards, even in a not linear fashion. One of the things I mentally noticed on myself, or from myself, or observing myself over, let's say, the period of the last years, was that sometimes I was so sleep deprived that I couldn't properly drive. And I saw it as a genuine risk that if I would drive now, I might fall into second or micro sleep. I think it's called microsleep. There's another word in my language, so I was trying to say another word. I one time can remember that in the morning I drove, and I already had been awake for maybe 2 hours, and then I just drove basically somewhere else where I could actually sleep 10 or 20 minutes. So I couldn't drive for around 40 minutes or 45 minutes with sleeping 4 hours a night and so on and so forth. And I couldn't drive for 40 or 45 minutes continuously. And this also made me thinking, but it's not that it changed my thinking on this, because it had worked so well. This time scheduling had worked so well, and it probably had also optimized my sleep. So in the last few weeks, where I actually tried to sleep 8 hours, it took quite some time. And I also, still to this day, wake up at least 2 or 3 times during the night. And usually it is around 6 hours. In the beginning, it was around 3.5 hours, usually, because 3.5 hours might have been what I actually slept often during the night. I want to take a moment to compliment Matthew Walker's writing in this book. It is direct. It is very direct, actually. It is not euphemistic about this whole thing, about the negative effects of sleep, and how we as a society, and maybe also me as a person, how we all together kind of just say. I want to explain this framing. If I say I was able to run, for example, a 5K in, let's say, 20 minutes, and I only sleep 4 hours a night because I'm Casey Neistat. And because I'm Casey Neistat, of course I maybe would be able to do more not because I'm Casey Neistat, but I would be able to do more if I slept additionally. But I don't, and I still am at this high level, so look at you. And that's, I think, kind of maybe the underlying psychology of this, that if I function like you and I sleep less than you, then I seem to have superior genetics, I seem to have more restorative sleep, even though I sleep less. I seem to overall just be better than you, because you need to sleep more, so you need more restoration. So there seems to be a common understanding of sleep as the thing that restores us, that regenerates us. And if I need less of this, then I obviously am basically better. I'm functioning at a higher level. I could function at an even higher level, but at least I don't have to if I can also survive on 6 hours a night and still perform better compared to everybody else in this room or I don't know where. And this thinking, and also the fact that up until now, and maybe up until the next 100 years, or up until recent history, there was just often a framing of time and a framing of wages that the wage was paid per hour of time. This might change in the future, but it still is very much the case that if you have a 40-hour work week, then you need to actually work, in most cases, 40 hours. Of course, maybe you can also work a little bit less than this and maybe do a project at home and write 2 hours for the same amount of time or for the same amount of effort you put in, because you found out something that increases your efficiency by 10%, like napping in between, that you actually didn't work all this time, but you actually napped in between and therefore you needed less time. But then who is gonna pay you for this, or who is gonna say that this is not betrayal? So if you then say, I worked for 2 hours, but you actually didn't work for 2 hours, then, well, that's kind of lying. And so the decoupling of the wage and also the absolute time investment kind of just keeps this, maybe keeps this mentality, or keeps this thinking, not this mentality or this thinking, but makes it, or incentivizes a thinking that is still based on basically absolute hours and not just performance per unit of time. But then if the unit of time is always the thing that is paid out as a wage or salary, then it obviously incentivizes basically not working as efficiently as one could potentially be working, and maybe also not restoring yourself as efficiently as you could, because, well, it might not be necessary, or it might not lead to better performance, or it might not lead to a bigger wage or salary, because you need to work 40 hours a week anyway. We estimate that more than 50% of all children with an ADHD diagnosis actually have a sleep disorder, yet a small fraction know of their sleep condition and its ramifications. A major public health awareness campaign by governments, perhaps without influence from pharmaceutical lobbying groups, is needed on this issue. Caffeine is everywhere. Sugar is everywhere. Every time I go to the grocery store, I have to kind of suppress the urge to buy just random things from the grocery store. That these random things are completely irrational to buy, because there seems to be evidence that eating these things over long periods of time causes basically life shortening. So every time you eat something like this, or every time you drink caffeine that then gives you not a full night of sleep, but actually it decreases your sleep quality every time you drink alcohol, and then it decreases your sleep quality every time you basically do something that decreases your sleep quality, or in the long term reduces, if you don't restore yourself through the night, then the next day you are maybe 1% less compared to the ideal you could have been, to the restored ideal of 100% maybe at 18 years old. Your body was once in the best condition at 18 years old. That's what I'm trying to say. And if you then are 99%, and then 1% less, and 1% less, and 1% less, then over time, obviously, you degrade, and not only at a linear rate, but actually it accumulates, because 1% over time, again and again and again, is compound interest, or works like compound interest. And if you degrade yourself a little bit, and then you're not able to pull off this workout, and this workout, and this workout is 10% less efficient, and this workout is 1% less efficient, and so on and so on and so on, then you're basically going into a loop where you never basically get the positive compound effect of working out, or the positive compound effect of nights of sleep. One thinking, maybe I introduced another quote here to get all the different quotes I actually have in this list. The physical and mental impairments caused by one night of bad sleep dwarf those caused by an equivalent absence of food or exercise. Now I want to say something unrelated, nonetheless, I will say it. The framing I have for myself is that, let's assume I'm able to live on this planet for 75 years. That seems to be kind of the average life expectation. Maybe it's 80 years, but that changes probably, and so I took a multiple of 5, and in this case 75. Now I deduct basically 30% of this, 33% to be exact, 1/3. Because even if the life expectancy is 75 years, these are not secure years. This just means that the bell curve is, in a way, such that there are people that live longer and shorter. Now, what are the chances that I live shorter? I don't know, but I have to include this risk of living shorter into basically my calculation, which then gives me more secure years. This means a few years ago, not really calculated, but just said, okay, it would probably make sense to assume that I live until age 50. And if I die at age 50 and I didn't do all the things that I want to do, then it's basically my fault. I mean, it's all my fault anyway, but this framing helped me quite a bit to understand how short actually my life then would become if I only would become 50 years old. And as I was then crossing the line of half of this life, 25 years old, I began to think about very many things that I might have maybe thought about before. One of these things is that I only had a few thousand days left to live. And a few thousand days left to live, if you now just say, okay, let's say every single night you track your sleep. And let's give this sleep a score. And the score, if it is 100, then you are fully restored, at least to the day before. But let's assume you're not fully restored. Let's assume you only sleep with 99% sleep efficiency, which, well, my sleep scores, at least at this point in time, I didn't have sleep scores, but in the last months and years, they actually were way worse. That is sometimes 25, sometimes 50, sometimes 67, but that's kind of the maximum I ever got to with 6 hours of sleep. But before, I only slept 4 hours at night, and then I woke myself up with an alarm, or I overslept the alarm, and so on and so forth. If you go only 99% for the next 8,000 nights, and that's what was kind of left. So we can do a quick calculation. If we assume 25 years left to live, and we multiply it by 365, we get 9,125 days. Now, if we assume that you don't restore yourself properly, but you only sleep with 99% sleep efficiency, and you start at age 25, which we now assume is the optimal age for everything. Then we can calculate very easily 9,125 multiplied by 0.99, which would then result in the wrong result. The right calculation would actually be 0.99, and then like this. I don't know what to call this. And is also not showing because, my calculator is out of battery. We click on result, and it shows a number. It's 1.4 multiplied by times 10. I don't know how to pronounce this in English, actually. It looks like this. It's a very small number, and that's kind of the result. It basically degrades your body to nothing. Multiplying 0.99. A 99% sleep score. If I calculated this correctly, and I assume that I made a mistake because I don't know, but if I calculated this correctly with my very limited mathematical skills, then it degrades your body to nothing. Let's just assume this. I mean, a number with minus 40. Or let's just read what Copilot actually says. The value of 0.99 with the exponent of 9,125 is a very small number that is close to 0. This is because any number less than 1 raised to a large power tends to approach 0. In the book, Matthew Walker actually also talks about the potential reasons of why we age, and there seems to be sleep quality loss with people who are higher in age. Now, if you only slept 99%, and we assumed just sleep is the thing that restores us ideally to 100%, but then if you don't sleep ideally, then you're not your previous day version of yourself that maybe starts out with 100%. But then 99% degrades even over only the 9,000 sleep opportunities you have left, the nights you have ahead of you, until you reach age 50, degrade your body, at least according to this, to nothing, if we make all of these assumptions. Of course, now people don't die at age 50, but I think it just shows the power of just less and less and less and less, even if you still sleep at 99% every single night. And these, of course, there seems to be, at least in my mind, a lack of understanding for basically relations like this. And maybe I shouldn't therefore tinker with sleep. That's kind of the end resolution. And maybe I just try to get 8 hours of sleep, even though I don't know. Even though I don't know. Maybe there is an ideal sleep system where I can't sleep 6 hours. Or maybe not.